On Father's Day morning, in the quiet suburbs of Ohio, Charles Miller sat on his old couch, sunlight streaming through faded curtains, his heart carrying a fragile hope. His daughter Jessica had promised him a surprise. For 20 years, since the passing of his wife, Charles had poured every ounce of himself into Jessica's future, selling his fishing boat to pay her tuition, skipping vacations and working overtime so she could start her married life strong. Today, for the first time in years, he dared to believe that sacrifice might be remembered. The house smelled faintly of lemon polish, a habit Charles kept from his late wife, and the family photographs on the mantel told the story of a father and daughter bound by love. Yet when the doorbell rang and Jessica appeared with her husband Ethan, something in her polished smile and his smug expression unsettled him. Jessica carried a flimsy gift bag, while Ethan leaned in the doorway as though he already knew the punchline to a cruel joke. "Happy Father's Day, Dad," Jessica said, handing him the bag. Inside, Charles found a pair of slippers worth barely $20. He forced a smile, his voice steady, but his chest aching. He didn't know yet, but across town, another man, Richard, Jessica's father-in-law, would soon be receiving a gift worth $15,000, bought with Charles's own money, and that single truth was about to change everything. Charles Miller sat in his modest Ohio living room, the sunlight catching dust motes in the air as he pulled the slippers from the crinkled gift bag. $20, the price tag dangling, almost mocking him. He turned them in his hands, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Jessica, his only daughter, stood before him with a carefully practiced smile, the kind that looked more like a photograph than genuine warmth. "Something practical, Dad," she said lightly, brushing a strand of her auburn hair back. "You don't need anything fancy." Her husband, Ethan, leaned against the doorframe, his expensive loafers crossed at the ankle, smirking as though he were in on some private joke. "You're a simple man, Charles," Ethan added, his tone dripping with condescension. "Slippers suit you just fine." The words stung, though Charles didn't let them see. For decades he had worked long hours at the auto plant, given up dreams of traveling with his late wife, and even sold his beloved boat to cover Jessica's tuition. He had done it gladly, believing every sacrifice built a better life for her. And here he sat, holding a pair of discount slippers, as though this token summed up all that he meant. His eyes flicked toward the mantel, where photos told the story of his life: Jessica at 5 years old in pigtails, Jessica at 16 in her graduation gown, Jessica at 23 on her wedding day, her hand in his as tears blurred his vision. Each frame carried love, sacrifice, and pride. Yet in that moment, with Ethan's smugness thickening the air, Charles felt like he had been erased from her story. "Thank you," he said softly, folding the slippers with care. His voice was steady, but his heart raced with a storm of emotions. Gratitude mixed with humiliation, pride tangled with disappointment. He glanced at the photo of his late wife, Mary, her gentle eyes seeming to watch from the frame. He wondered what she would say if she were still here. Had he failed as a father? Had all those sacrifices turned Jessica into someone who saw him not as her dad, but as an obligation? The silence stretched. Charles cleared his throat, trying to bridge the distance. "Would you two like to stay for coffee?" Jessica shook her head almost instantly, glancing at her phone. "We have plans. Dinner at Richard's place." Richard, her father-in-law, was a successful businessman, wealthy in ways Charles could never be. Ethan's lips twitched with satisfaction as he mentioned, "Yeah, my dad's hosting tonight. Big night." They exchanged a glance, one Charles couldn't quite interpret. The message was clear. They had more important places to be. Within minutes, the front door shut behind them. Leaving Charles alone in the heavy quiet of the house, he carried the slippers into the kitchen, the sound of the clock in the living room ticking like a hammer against his thoughts. On the counter, the flimsy bag caught on the edge and tore, the tissue paper spilling out like a broken promise. He set the slippers down and poured himself a cup of coffee, his hands trembling just enough to rattle the mug. The bitterness of the drink grounded him, but memories returned unbidden. Jessica, at 12, crying on his shoulder when she lost her first friend. Jessica, at 18, begging for a designer dress for prom. Jessica, at 20, asking him to co-sign a loan. Each time, he had said yes, believing in her, protecting her, sacrificing without complaint. Now he stared at the $20 slippers and wondered if he had been raising his daughter or raising her entitlement. Out the kitchen window, the neighborhood looked perfect: freshly mowed lawns, flags on porches, kids riding bikes. But inside, Charles felt hollow, the echo of Ethan's voice gnawing at him. A simple man. Slippers suit you. He turned back toward the mantel to Mary's picture, her smile frozen in time. He whispered to her memory, "I gave her everything, Mary, and this is what I get." His phone buzzed on the counter, pulling him from his thoughts. A new notification lit the screen. He picked it up, and what he saw made his stomach drop. There was Jessica, smiling in a social media photo, sitting at her father-in-law Richard's dinner table. And in the center of the photo, gleaming under the chandelier lights, stood a brand new mahogany desk, hand-carved, polished, and magnificent. The caption read, "To the best father-in-law, a gift worthy of your class." Charles's hands shook. As he zoomed in on the photo, the desk wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was the very thing Jessica had begged him for months ago. $15,000 for what she claimed were emergency medical bills. Slippers sat silent on the counter, their price tag dangling, as Charles felt something deep inside him snap, not loudly, but like a lock sliding into place. Charles Miller sat at the kitchen table, his coffee cooling in the cup, the $20 slippers resting on the counter like a cruel joke. His phone screen still glowed in his trembling hands. The picture was impossible to ignore: his daughter Jessica, radiant under the soft lights of her father-in-law's grand dining room, smiling like she had the world at her feet. And there, just behind her, was the gift. A massive, hand-carved mahogany desk, its polished surface gleaming beneath a crystal chandelier. Charles could see the intricate craftsmanship even through the photo, the ornate edges, the deep reddish-brown wood. That spoke of wealth and status. In the caption, Jessica's words mocked him more than Ethan's smug laughter ever could. "To the best father-in-law, a gift worthy of your class." Class. That word cut him deeper than he expected. He leaned back in his chair, the phone slipping from his hand onto the table. Sound of it hitting the wood echoed through the quiet kitchen. He stared at the slippers. $20, and then at the desk. $15,000. The comparison twisted like a knife. It wasn't just about money. It was about value. Jessica had placed her father-in-law, Richard, on a pedestal, showering him with honor and luxury. But her own father, the man who raised her, who worked double shifts at the auto plant, who gave up his dreams after her mother Mary passed, was given something that looked like it had been picked up at a discount aisle on the way over. Charles's chest tightened. He thought back to the phone call 2 months ago. Jessica's voice had cracked with desperation. "Daddy, I hate asking, but I need $15,000. It's medical. It's serious, please." He'd wired the money that same day. "No?" Questions asked. He had sat in this very chair afterward, telling himself it was worth it. That's what fathers did. They sacrificed so their children could live without fear. He'd even whispered to Mary's picture on the mantel, "I did good, didn't I? She still needs me." Now, staring at that photo, he realized the truth. The only one who had been fooled was him. The kitchen clock ticked louder, each second a hammer pounding in his skull. He pressed his palms flat on the table, trying to steady himself. His breath came shallow, ragged. On the screen, Jessica's smile beamed back at him, her manicured hand resting lightly on Richard's shoulder, Ethan grinning smugly at her side. The desk shone between them, a monument to their betrayal. Charles picked up the phone again, zooming in on the photo as if the pixels might reveal a mistake. Maybe it wasn't the desk she bought with his money. Maybe there was some explanation. But the more he looked, the more he knew. This was it. This was where his sacrifice had gone, not to medical bills, not to helping his daughter through a crisis, but to a gift meant to impress a man who already lived in wealth. He pushed back, his chair so hard it scraped against the kitchen tile. The sound was sharp, angry, like the way his heart felt in his chest. He paced the kitchen, his hands clenching and unclenching, his breath uneven. Why him, he thought. Why Richard? Why does he get her honor, her love, her respect, while I get slippers? The question hung heavy in the room. And in that silence, something shifted inside Charles. For years he had brushed off small slights, swallowed disappointment. Told himself Jessica was just busy, just distracted, just young. He'd made excuses for her coldness, her dismissiveness, even her arrogance. But this was no misunderstanding. This was deliberate. A choice. His phone buzzed again, breaking his thoughts. Another notification. Jessica had posted a video clip now, showing Richard sitting proudly at the new desk while Ethan laughed in the background. Jessica's caption read, "For the man who's always there for us." Charles froze, the words stabbing at him. Always there for us? He thought of the nights he spent in the factory, sweat stinging his eyes, so Jessica could graduate debt-free. He thought of Mary's funeral, when Jessica was only 10. How he had promised that little girl through her tears, "I'll always be here for you." But none of that mattered to her anymore. But to Jessica, being there meant wealth, status, and Charles set the phone down and pressed his fists against the countertop. His reflection stared back at him in the dark kitchen window. Gray hair, tired eyes, lines etched deep from years of labor and sacrifice. He barely recognized the man he saw, but in those eyes, a hardness was forming. "Resolve," he whispered. Aloud, as though Mary could still hear him, "No more. Not again." And in that moment, Charles knew something had changed. The part of him that had always forgiven, always excused, always sacrificed, had finally gone quiet. In its place stood something new. He wasn't sure yet what it meant. But he knew this. The next time Jessica called him petty or dismissed his worth, she would not be speaking to the same man, because Charles Miller was done being the fool. Charles Miller stood in his kitchen, the glow of his phone still burning in his mind long after he set it down. The photo of that mahogany desk, $15,000 of polished betrayal, would not leave him. His daughter Jessica's caption echoed through his head, "For the man who's always there for us." He pressed his hands against the counter. Staring at the $20 slippers lying limp in their torn gift bag, the contrast was unbearable. He had been given scraps while his money, his sacrifice, had been turned into a throne for another man. But it wasn't only the insult that cut deep. It was the memory. Charles sank into his chair, his hands trembling as he reached for the coffee mug, now cold and bitter. 2 months ago, Jessica had called him, her voice laced with panic. He remembered every word. "Daddy, I don't know what to do," she had sobbed. "It's medical. It's urgent. I need $15,000. Please, you're the only one I can turn to." The desperation in her tone had broken him. She was his little girl again, scared and fragile, reaching out to him. Without hesitation, Charles had driven to the bank that afternoon, drained the account he had been saving for his own retirement dreams, wired the money to her. He hadn't asked questions. He hadn't demanded proof. He hadn't thought twice. Fathers didn't do that. Fathers sacrificed now. Staring at the photo of the desk gleaming in Richard's study, Charles realized the cruel truth. Jessica had lied. There were no medical bills. There was no emergency. It had all been a story crafted, rehearsed and delivered with tears convincing enough to pierce his heart. The realization shook him to his core. He pushed back from the table, his chair scraping across the tile. His chest rose and fell in jagged breaths as anger surged up, hot and relentless. For years he had brushed off the signs, her expensive tastes, her dismissive attitude, Ethan's smug entitlement. He had told himself she was just young, just finding her way. But this wasn't immaturity. This was manipulation. He paced the kitchen, his footsteps sharp against the floor. His reflection caught in the window again, gray hair, weary eyes, the face of a man who had given everything and been left with nothing. He thought of Mary, his late wife, her voice soft but steady, whispering from memory, "Don't let anyone walk all over you, Charles, not even family." He closed his eyes, the ache in his chest hardening into something sharper. She was right. He had let it go too far. The phone buzzed again on the counter. A new message lit up the screen. Jessica's name glared at him. For a moment, he considered ignoring it, but his hand moved before he could stop himself. He unlocked the phone. The message read, "Hope you understand, Daddy. Richard deserves this. Please don't make a scene." Charles stared at the words, his jaw tightening. Don't make a scene. As if his betrayal, his sacrifices, his life's work meant nothing more than an inconvenience. His fingers hovered over the keys, but he stopped himself. Responding now would only feed her arrogance. Instead, he set the phone down and drew in a long, steady breath. He walked to the mantel, his eyes on the photo of Mary. "She lied to me, Mary," he whispered, his voice breaking. "She looked me in the eye and lied." The words felt like shards of glass in his throat. For the first time in his life, Charles felt the full weight of betrayal, not from a stranger, not from an acquaintance, but from the daughter he had. Raised with every ounce of love he had, the slippers still sat on the counter, their price tag dangling like a cruel reminder. He picked them up and held them in his hands, squeezing them until his knuckles whined. It wasn't about the slippers. It wasn't even about the desk. It was about trust that had been shattered in a single merciless blow. Charles set the slippers down carefully, almost tenderly, and wiped at his eyes. His breath slowed, his shoulders squared. The storm inside him wasn't gone, but it had changed. The grief was still there, but now it was laced with something new. Resolve. For decades, he had believed his role was to sacrifice, to give, to forgive, to endure. But that belief had left him standing in a kitchen with $20 slippers, while his daughter paraded a $15,000 gift bought with his own money. And in that moment, Charles made a silent vow. There would be no more lies, no more manipulation, no more sacrifices thrown into a bottomless pit of entitlement. Jessica had crossed a line, and Charles Miller was no longer the man who would let it slide. This was the lie that broke him. It was also the lie that would set him free. Charles Miller sat in silence long after the kitchen clock chimed 9. The house around him felt emptier than ever, the air heavy with betrayal. The $20 slippers still rested on the counter, their price tag dangling like an accusation, and his phone lay dark. Though he knew Jessica would call again. For years he had been her safety net, her rescuer, her provider, when she wanted. To attend a private college, he sold his beloved fishing boat, the boat he and Mary had dreamed of retiring on together. When she wanted the wedding of her dreams, he took out a loan and picked up overtime at the auto plant, working double shifts, until his body ached. He had convinced himself each sacrifice was worth it, that his daughter's happiness was the only legacy he needed. But now, sitting in the dim kitchen, with nothing but cold coffee and cheap slippers, Charles faced the truth he'd avoided for years. His sacrifices had turned into expectations. Jessica didn't see his giving as love anymore. She saw it as her right. He walked to the mantel and stood before the family photos, his eyes resting on Mary's picture. Her gentle smile seemed to ask the question he'd been avoiding. When will you stop letting her take from you? Charles closed his eyes, memories flooding back. Jessica at 10, crying into his shirt after a fight at school. Jessica at 16, begging for a designer dress, promising to pay him back. Jessica at 25, whispering through tears that she couldn't make rent until he stepped in again. Every memory was tied to him reaching into his wallet, pulling from his savings, giving until he had nothing left but calloused hands and broken dreams. The realization was brutal. He had raised a daughter who knew how to ask. Deep ache filled his chest, grief mixing with anger. But beneath it, something stirred, something stronger than sadness. Resolve. He wasn't sure when it happened. But the man staring back from the darkened window wasn't the same Charles who had sat here earlier, crushed by disappointment. His reflection showed gray hair and weary eyes. Yes, but also a hardness that had never been there before. The kind of hardness that comes when a man finally says enough. He pulled out a worn notebook from the drawer, the one Mary used to call his fix-it book, where he jotted down everything from grocery lists to home repair plans. Tonight, he opened it to a clean page and wrote 3 headings across the top. What she knows, what she doesn't, what I want her to think. His pen moved slowly at first, and faster, his mind sharper with every word. Under what she knows, wrote, I gave her the money. She believes I'll never stop. Under what she doesn't, he added. I'm not her fool anymore. I will protect what's mine, and under what I want her to think, he wrote. That I'm still the man she can manipulate, till I decide otherwise. He stared at the words, the ink sinking into the paper like a promise. For years, he had felt powerless, trapped in a cycle of sacrifice and disappointment. But this page told him otherwise. He wasn't powerless. He still had choices. Charles set down the pen and leaned back in his chair, his chest rising with a steadier breath. He thought of Mary's voice again. Don't let anyone walk all over you, Charles. Not even family. For the first time in decades, he realized he could honor her words. Asterisk, the clock on the wall ticked steadily. No longer a hammer against his thoughts, but a rhythm guiding him forward. Each second was no longer a reminder of what he had lost. It was a countdown to what he would reclaim. Asterisk, he rose from the table, grabbed his jacket, and stepped out into the cool night air. The suburban street lay quiet, the scent of damp grass rising after a short rain. For years he had walked this neighborhood as a man weighed down by duty. Tonight, his steps felt different. Lighter, but firmer. Charles Miller wasn't just a father betrayed. He was a man who had finally reached his breaking point and discovered his strength on the other side. The pain was still there. Unforgiving, but it no longer controlled him. It fueled him. It carved a path forward, one step at a time. And as he walked beneath the dim glow of the streetlights, Charles made a vow to himself and to the memory of Mary. He would never again be the man who gave everything and received nothing. From this moment on, he wasn't just surviving betrayal. He was taking back his life. The next morning, Charles Miller woke with a heaviness in his chest, the kind that comes after a night of restless thoughts. He had barely slept. The image of that mahogany desk haunted him, gleaming in his mind, like a monument to his daughter's betrayal. $15,000 money he had scraped together by denying himself. Money he had handed over without hesitation was sitting in another man's study, polished and proud. He sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee, his notebook still open from the night before. The 3 columns stared back at him. What she knows, what she doesn't, what I want her to think. The words he had written were steady, but he knew it wasn't enough to just feel betrayed. He needed proof, hard undeniable evidence that Jessica had used him. For years he had trusted her word. Now he knew better. By mid-morning, Charles was behind the wheel of his aging pickup, heading toward downtown Cleveland. Rain threatened overhead, gray clouds pressing low as if echoing the storm inside him. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw set. He wasn't a man used to confrontation, but he also wasn't a man who backed away from truth. The streets grew busier as he reached the heart of the city, the sidewalks lined with boutiques and showrooms. Finally, he pulled into a narrow lot beside a gleaming storefront Kavanaugh's Fine Furnishings, the kind of place where businessmen bought desks to project power. Charles had passed by it once before, years ago, when Mary had teased that one day he'd buy a fancy chair for his retirement den. That dream had died with her. Now, stepping inside, he felt like a stranger in enemy territory. The air smelled of leather and polish, the floor shining beneath crystal lights. A young sales associate in a tailored suit approached, her smile polite but assessing. Charles was aware of his worn jacket, the calloused hands that had fixed more engines than pens. He didn't belong here. But he didn't care. I need information, Charles said, pulling a folded printout from his pocket. He had printed Jessica's social media photo at the library that morning, the desk circled in red ink. His voice was steady, though his heart pounded. Was this piece purchased here? The clerk's smile faltered slightly, her eyes flicking. To the photo. Recognition flashed across her face before she quickly masked it. Let me get our manager, she said, slipping behind a velvet curtain. Charles stood in the silence of the showroom, the tick of an ornate grandfather clock echoing in his ears. That sound again, time, relentless, mocking. He stared at the desks displayed in the glass cases, each one a symbol of wealth he had never chased. Wealth his daughter apparently craved. Moments later, a man in his 60s approached, bald on top glasses perched low on his nose. "I'm Mr. Kavanaugh," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. He held the printout in his hand. "This is a mahogany executive desk." "Yes, we sold one like it in March." Charles swallowed, his throat dry. "Do you know who bought it?" Kavanaugh studied him for a moment, then gestured toward a small office. "Let's step inside." The office was quiet, lined with ledgers and framed certificates. Charles slid his bank statement across the desk, a red circle marking the $15,000 charge. "This is my account," he said, his voice low but steady. "I need to know if it was used for this purchase." Kavanaugh tapped on a tablet, scrolling through records. After a long pause, he nodded. "Yes. March 15th, paid in full. A young woman made the purchase. She mentioned it was for a family member." Charles closed his eyes briefly, his chest tightening. There it was, confirmation, not suspicion, not assumption proof. Jessica had walked into this very store, used his card, and bought that desk for Richard. Was she alone? Charles asked, though he already knew the answer. "No," Kavanaugh said. "She was with a young man. Husband, I assume." They seemed very sure of themselves. The words hit Charles like a punch. Jessica and Ethan, together, confident, smiling, no doubt. As they signed his name away, he folded the paper, slowly, carefully, as though it were evidence in a trial. His hand didn't shake this time. The trembling was gone, replaced by a cold clarity. "Thank you," Charles said, his voice clipped but polite. He stood, his back straight, his resolve like steel, as he stepped back into the drizzle of the Cleveland street. The truth settled in his bones. Jessica hadn't stumbled. She hadn't made a mistake. She had lied deliberately with Ethan at her side. Charles walked back to his truck, the rain tapping against his jacket. His reflection in the window stared back at him, an older man. Weathered, worn, but not defeated. Not anymore. He slid behind the wheel, the sound of the rain drumming on the roof. For the first time in a long while, Charles felt steady, strong. He had the truth now, and the truth was sharper than any betrayal. And as he started the engine, one thought burned brighter than all the rest. Jessica believed she still had him under her thumb, but she had no idea what kind of man her father had become. Charles Miller drove home from downtown Cleveland with the rain still tapping lightly against his windshield, his thoughts as heavy as the gray skies above. The truth had been confirmed. Jessica hadn't stumbled into some misunderstanding. She had lived deliberately, boldly using his money to buy a $15,000 mahogany desk for Richard. Her father -in-law, back in his kitchen, Charles laid the folded papers from Kavanaugh's fine furnishings on the table. The evidence sat there like a weight. The bank statement, the purchase record, the photograph of Jessica smiling beside Richard with the desk gleaming in the background. For years, Charles had been the man who swallowed his hurt, who forgave, who turned the other cheek. But not this time. By evening, his phone buzzed again. Jessica's name flashed across the screen for the 10th time that day. He let it ring, then another call came, and another. Finally, he pressed accept, "Daddy." Jessica's voice burst through, too shrill, too impatient. "Why haven't you been answering? I've been calling all day." Charles gripped the phone tighter, his knuckles white. He took a slow breath. "I've been busy," he said evenly. His voice carried a steadiness he hadn't felt in years. "Checking on something." "What do you mean?" Jessica asked, her tone sharpening. "Like a $15,000 desk." The line went silent. Only the faint crackle of static filled the space between them. Charles could almost picture her standing in her pristine living room, her manicured, fingers clutching the phone, her eyes darting to Ethan in panic. "I don't know what you're talking about," she snapped at last, though there was a tremor beneath her words. "You're being ridiculous." Charles leaned back in his chair, staring at the stopped clock on the mantel. "Am I?" he said quietly. "I went to the store, Jessica. Kavanaugh's. They confirmed it. You and Ethan used my card. You told me it was for medical bills. You lied." Her laugh came out high-pitched and brittle. "My God, you always make a mountain out of nothing. It was a gift, okay? Richard has done so much for us, you wouldn't understand." Her words stung. But more than that, they revealed the truth. She wasn't apologizing. She was justifying. To her, Charles wasn't a father anymore. He was a resource, a means to impress others. A gift, Charles repeated, his tone flat. With my money. He looked me in the eye, Jessica. He told me it was for medical bills. Do you know what that means? Her voice rose, sharp and defensive. It means you don't get to control me. I'm not a kid anymore, Daddy. You don't get to tell me how to spend money. Then spend your own, Charles shot back. His tone cold, controlled, not mine. Silence stretched across the line. He could hear her breathing, quick and uneven like an animal cornered. You're so petty, she spat finally. Do you know how embarrassing this is? You're acting like a child. For a moment, Charles almost felt the familiar ache, the pull to back down, to make peace, to keep his daughter close. But then he remembered the look in her eyes when she handed him those slippers, the smug tilt of Ethan's smile, the glowing desk in Richard's home. Maybe I have been a child, Charles said, his voice like stone, believing my daughter still cared about me. But not anymore. Ow. Jessica's voice cracked. Daddy, stop. You're overreacting. Just fix it, okay? Put the money back. You always do. He closed his eyes, his grip steady on the phone. Not this time, Jessica. And with that, he ended the call. The silence in the kitchen afterward was deafening, but it wasn't the silence of defeat. It was the silence of resolve. Charles leaned back in his chair, staring at the photo of Mary on the mantel. Her gentle smile seemed to nod in quiet approval. For the first time in decades, Charles had stood his ground. He had confronted the daughter who had turned his love into leverage. He hadn't bent. The pain was sharp, yes, but beneath it was something new. Strength, and as the rain picked up outside, tapping harder against the windows, Charles knew this was only the beginning. Jessica and Ethan wouldn't let go of their golden goose so easily. But he was ready now, because the first confrontation was over. And Charles Miller had finally drawn the line. The morning after that first confrontation, Charles Miller woke with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. The ache of betrayal was still, there pressing heavy in his chest, but alongside it was something sharper resolve. He was no longer the man who would sit quietly and let his daughter take its advantage of him. The evidence from Kavanaugh's fine furnishings was tucked neatly in a folder on his kitchen counter. Every detail was there. The receipt, the transaction. Date, the proof that Jessica and Ethan had used his card. For years, Charles had been the one to turn a blind eye, convincing himself that family came before everything. But now he saw the truth. Family wasn't supposed to exploit you. He sat at the table, his old notebook open. The 3 columns he had written the night before stared back at him. What she knows, what she doesn't. What I want her to think. It wasn't just a list anymore. It was a plan. By mid-morning, Charles drove into the city, his truck rattling. Along the familiar stretch of highway that led to downtown Cleveland, he had an appointment with someone new, Margaret Dawson, a lawyer recommended by a retired buddy from the auto plant. Tough as nails, his friend had said. The kind of woman who doesn't scare easy. That was exactly what Charles needed. Margaret's office was cluttered, but alive. Piles of files stacked high, a faint scent of coffee lingering in the air. She greeted him with a firm handshake, her sharp eyes softened by laugh lines. So, you're Charles Miller, she said, motioning him to sit. I hear you've got a daughter with expensive taste. Charles gave a humorless chuckle. That's one way to put it. He laid the folder on her desk, sliding it across. Told me she needed money for medical bills. Instead, she bought her father-in-law a desk worth $15,000. Used my account to do it. Margaret flipped through the documents, her brow tightening. And you gave her direct access to your accounts? Charles nodded, ashamed. After her mother died, I thought I was doing right by her. Gave her every chance, every resource. She's my only child. His voice faltered. I never thought she'd do this. What? Margaret leaned back, tapping her pen against the folder. Mr. Miller, I'll be honest with you. She's not going to stop. It's not until you draw the line. We start by cutting off her access to your accounts. Then we secure your estate. If you don't, she'll bleed you dry." The bluntness stung. But it was the truth Charles already knew. He nodded. "Do it." By afternoon, Charles was sitting at his local bank, a stack of forms before him. The manager, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, explained each line in a clipped tone. "Once this is signed, your daughter will no longer have access to your accounts. Any attempt she makes will be declined immediately." Charles picked up the pen, his hand steady. He thought of Jessica's brittle laugh on the phone the night before, the way she had dismissed him as petty, the way she had ordered him to fix it, like you always do. That sentence had haunted him. She believed he would cave. She believed he would always be the father who gave and gave until nothing was left. Not anymore. With one firm stroke of the pen, Charles signed his name. The scratch of ink against paper felt final, like the turning of a lock. Door closing, the manager gathered the forms, his tone professional. "It will take effect immediately. She'll be notified." Charles thanked him, standing tall as he left the bank. The sun was brighter than it had been in days, warming his face as he stepped into the parking lot. For the first time, he felt like he had taken something back: his dignity, his control, his future. Later, over coffee in a small diner with Margaret, she raised an eyebrow at him. "So, did you pull the plug?" Charles smiled faintly. The first real smile in weeks. Signed and done. She's cut off. Margaret leaned back, satisfied. "Good. She hated it more than those slippers she gave you. But maybe it'll teach her a lesson." Charles sipped his coffee, the bitterness grounding him. "I don't know if she'll ever learn, but I'm done being her fool." His phone buzzed on the table. Jessica's name flashed across the screen. Again, he let it ring, then watched as a voicemail came through. Curious, he pressed play. Her voice erupted, shrill and furious. "Daddy, what the hell did you do? My card was declined. Fix this now, or I swear you'll regret it." Charles set the phone down slowly, the corner of his mouth tightening. The anger in her voice no longer crushed him, confirmed what he already knew. He had finally taken back control, and this time he wasn't giving it up. Charles Miller sat in his living room that evening, the house quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. His phone rested on the coffee table, screen dark, but he knew Jessica would call again. Ever since he cut her off at the bank, the messages had been relentless, angry, demanding, manipulative. For years he had given in, but now he let the phone ring, each unanswered call strengthening his resolve. He leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting toward the stopped clock on the mantel. That clock hadn't worked in years, yet tonight it felt symbolic. Jessica's time of using him was over. The next morning a message arrived that he didn't expect, not from Jessica. From William Harper, her father-in-law. The wealthy businessman, who now had a $15,000 mahogany desk sitting in his study. The man Jessica seemed to admire more than her own father. The voicemail was short, gruff, and unsettling. "Charles, we need to talk. Come by my office this afternoon." Charles played it twice, his jaw tightening. For years, William had been a distant presence in Jessica's life. A man she and Ethan looked up to, a man who represented the kind of success Charles could never provide. He had always tolerated William, even respected his accomplishments. But now, knowing the desk in William's office was bought with his money, the thought of facing him churned Charles's stomach. Still, he had to go. By 2 o'clock, Charles found himself walking into a sleek downtown office building. The marble floors gleamed beneath the fluorescent lights, and the air smelled faintly of polish and money. He felt out of place in his worn jacket and scuffed shoes, but he squared his shoulders. He had nothing to be ashamed of. A receptionist led him down a hall to a wide office where William sat behind the very desk in question. The mahogany surface gleamed under the light, rich and imposing, a symbol of wealth and power. But William didn't look powerful in that moment. His face was tight with anger, his hands clenched on the armrests of his leather chair. "Charles," William said, his voice low and gravelly, "I owe you an apology." The words caught Charles off guard. Stayed standing, unwilling to sit at the desk that had become the center of his humiliation. "Do you now?" he asked evenly. William reached for a velvet box on the desk and slid it forward. "This belongs to you." Charles glanced inside. Not papers, not money, something heavier. A set of keys and a purchase slip. Proof of the desk. "Didn't know," William continued, his voice tight. "Jessica told me this was her personal gift. She said she wanted to thank me for everything I've done for them. If I had known it was your money—" He trailed off, shaking his head in disgust. Charles studied him, trying to read the truth in his eyes. William's pride was obvious, but so was the hurt. He, too, had been lied to, manipulated. "She lied to both of us," Charles said finally, his voice steady. "I gave her that money for medical bills. That's what she told me. Instead, she used me." William slammed his palm on the desk, the sound echoing through the office. "She's been sniffing around my business too, asking questions, dropping hints about investments. I thought it was ambition. Now I see it's greed." For a moment, the two men sat in silence, not as rivals, not as in-laws, but as fathers betrayed by the same person. The same young woman they had both trusted. Charles finally pulled the velvet box toward him, his fingers brushing the polished wood. "I don't want pity, William. I just want what's right." William nodded, his expression grim. "And you'll have it. She won't get another dime from me. Not a favor, not a handout. I'm done." Charles closed the box carefully, the weight of it grounding him. He hadn't expected this meeting, hadn't expected William to stand with him instead of against him. Yet here they were, both men stripped of illusions. Both men staring at the wreckage Jessica had left in her wake. As he left the office, the velvet box tucked under his arm, Charles felt a strange calm settle over him. The tables had turned. Jessica had lost more than access to his accounts. She had lost her standing with William. 2. For the first time in years, Charles walked out of a room not as the man left behind, but as the man holding the truth. And though the road ahead would not be easy, he knew one thing for certain. Jessica's web of lies was unraveling, thread by thread. When Charles Miller stepped out of William Harper's office, the velvet box heavy in his hands, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Relief. Not victory, not triumph. Just the quiet freedom that comes when the truth finally comes to light. Jessica's scheme had collapsed. She had lost access to his accounts, and now William knew the truth too. The desk she had paraded as a symbol of her generosity was nothing more than evidence of betrayal. Charles walked through the Cleveland streets that afternoon with a lighter step. For the first time since Mary's passing, he wasn't carrying the weight of excuses for his daughter's behavior. He was simply carrying himself. A week later, Charles returned to Kavanaugh's fine furnishings. With Margaret Dawson's guidance, he arranged to have the desk sold back through a private collector. When the paperwork cleared, a check was placed in his hand, $14,500 after fees. He stared at it for a long moment. The number represented all the nights of overtime, all the broken promises, all the sacrifices that had been twisted against him. But this time, he wouldn't use it to prop up Jessica's lifestyle. He wouldn't hand it over, hoping for gratitude. That never came. Instead, Charles drove straight to a small veterans shelter on the east side of town. The building was old, the paint peeling, but inside, the director greeted him with a warmth that caught him off guard. "This will change." "Lives, Mr. Miller," she said, her eyes shining as he placed the check in her hands. Beds, hot meals, medical care wheel, be able to help so many. Charles nodded, his throat tight. For the first time in years, his money was going exactly where it belonged, not wasted on greed, but poured into hope. That desk, once a symbol of betrayal, had been transformed into something meaningful. Later that evening, he sat in the park with Margaret, watching the late spring sun dip low across the lake. Children laughed on the swings, their voices carried on the breeze. Margaret leaned back on the bench, her gray blazer catching the light. "You've come a long way, Charles," she said softly. "From slippers to this." Charles chuckled. A real laugh this time, not bad for an old man who thought he'd lost everything. "You didn't lose everything," Margaret said. turning toward him. You just gave too much of yourself away. Now, you've taken it back. Her words sank deep, steadying him. He thought of Mary, of her soft warnings, of her belief that love wasn't meant to be blind sacrifice. For years he had confused giving with love, until Jessica had turned it into entitlement. Now he understood. Love required boundaries too. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the water in streaks of gold. Charles picked up a flat stone and skimmed it across the surface of the lake. Ripples spread wide, each circle larger than the last. He smiled faintly. That's what he wanted his choices to be, now ripples that reached beyond himself. For the first time in decades, Charles felt free. Charles's story reminds us of something powerful. Sacrifice without boundaries isn't love, it's surrender. True love doesn't drain you dry. It respects your worth. Sometimes the hardest thing a parent or anyone can do is to say enough. But when you do, you don't just reclaim your dignity. You also make space for healing, purpose, and even new beginnings. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to set boundaries with someone you love? Your story might inspire others. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story that might change the way you see life.